Imagine staring out at the horizon on a perfectly clear Pacific morning, watching the most lethal naval armada on the planet operating with absolute impunity. 5 minutes later, the pride of an empire is burning uncontrollably, thousands of sailors are dead or dying, and the entire trajectory of global history has violently snapped in a new direction. This is not Hollywood fiction. This is the Battle of Midway, a brutal, chaotic, and meticulously calculated slaughter that broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy in a single morning. If you want to understand the unforgiving mechanics of war, the raw mathematics of firepower, and the tactical decisions that decide the fate of nations, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below with your thoughts on carrier warfare, and let us dig into the anatomy of a naval masterpiece. To understand how 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sent to the bottom of the Pacific on June 4, 1942, we cannot just look at the battle itself. We have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic environment that bred the Japanese war machine. An environment rooted in deep-seated resentment and a fatal overconfidence. Following the First World War, the major naval powers gathered to sign the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. The goal was to prevent a crippling arms race, but the treaty established a strict tonnage ratio for capital ships. The United States and Great Britain were allowed 525,000 tons each, while Japan was capped at 350,000 tons. This was the infamous 5-to-3 ratio. To the American and British delegations, it was pragmatic diplomacy. To the Japanese military establishment, it was a profound national insult. They felt they were being treated as a second-class empire by the Western powers. This treaty forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to adopt a specific doctrine to counter American numerical superiority. They developed the concept of Kantai Kessen, or the decisive battle doctrine. The idea was simple but incredibly rigid. If war broke out, the Japanese would use submarines and light forces to whittle down the American Pacific Fleet as it steamed westward across the ocean. Then, the untouched Japanese battleship fleet would engage the weakened Americans in one massive winner-take-all gunnery duel, annihilating them in a single afternoon. It was a strategy heavily influenced by their stunning victory over the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. But there was a massive flaw in this thinking. Is this not exactly like General Robert E. Lee marching the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania in 1863? Lee had built up an aura of invincibility, believing his men could break any Union line, which led directly to the catastrophic overconfidence of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. The Japanese Navy in early 1942 suffered from the exact same invincibility complex. They had bombed Pearl Harbor, swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, and had not lost a single major warship. They believed the American sailor was soft, undisciplined, and incapable of absorbing heavy casualties. However, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, knew that the clock was ticking. He knew that the industrial capacity of the United States was a sleeping giant that, once fully awakened, would drown Japan in a sea of steel, aluminum, and high explosives. Yamamoto needed to force the American aircraft carriers, which had luckily escaped the attack on Pearl Harbor, into a decisive battle where they could be permanently destroyed. The psychological trigger that set the Midway operation in motion occurred on April 18, 1942. 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle launched from the pitching deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. They flew hundreds of miles and dropped a handful of 500-pound bombs on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. In terms of physical destruction, the Doolittle raid achieved almost nothing. But in terms of strategic impact, it was an earthquake. The Japanese homeland, the sacred soil of the emperor, had been violated. Yamamoto was deeply humiliated and realized the American carriers were a dagger pointed directly at Japan's throat. He drew up a massively complex plan to draw the United States Pacific Fleet into a trap. The bait was Midway Atoll. Midway is a tiny speck of coral and sand, barely 2 square miles in total area, sitting right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. Why would an island nation with a fraction of America's industrial base pick a fight over a useless piece of coral? Because Midway was the ultimate strategic tripwire. It was too close to Hawaii for the Americans to ignore, but just far enough away that land-based bombers from Oahu could not easily cover it. Yamamoto's plan involved splitting his massive fleet into several different task forces, spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean, to confuse the Americans and spring a trap once the U.S. carriers rushed to defend the atoll. Let us break down the opposing forces, starting with the tip of the Japanese spear, the Kido Butai, or First Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. This was the most lethal naval aviation force the world had ever seen. Nagumo brought 4 heavy fleet carriers to the fight: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. These were veteran ships with highly experienced air crews. The flagship Akagi was a monster. Originally laid down as a battle cruiser, she was converted into a carrier to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty. She displaced over 36,000 tons and could make 31 knots. But she, like all Japanese carriers, possessed a fatal design flaw. Japanese naval architects prioritized offensive striking power over ship survivability. Their carriers featured fully enclosed hangar decks with no open sides to vent explosive forces. Furthermore, Japanese damage control philosophy was practically non-existent compared to Western standards. They did not utilize central fire mains filled with pressurized water, and their aviation fuel lines were routed haphazardly through the ship. They treated their multi-million-dollar capital ships like disposable glass cannons, capable of shattering the enemy but fragile if hit. The aircraft carried by the Kido Butai reflected this same philosophy. The primary fighter was the legendary Mitsubishi A6M20. The Zero was an aerodynamic marvel, weighing just over 3,700 pounds empty. It had an incredible combat radius and unparalleled maneuverability. But to achieve this performance, Mitsubishi engineers stripped away everything that did not contribute to speed or range. The Zero had absolutely no armor plating to protect the pilot, and it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst of .50 caliber incendiary ammunition from an American fighter could instantly turn a Zero into a falling fireball. For strike capabilities, the Japanese relied on the Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bomber and the Aichi D-3A1 Val dive bomber. The Kate was an excellent aircraft, carrying the devastating Type 91 aerial torpedo. Unlike American torpedoes of the time, the Type 91 actually worked. It ran straight, ran true, and packed a massive explosive payload. The Val dive bomber was highly accurate, responsible for sinking more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft in the early years of the war. In total, Nagumo's 4 carriers brought roughly 248 combat aircraft to the fight, supported by 2 fast battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers. On the other side of the strategic chessboard sat Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was facing a nightmare scenario. He was heavily outnumbered, outgunned, and his forces were stretched thin. But Nimitz possessed a weapon that Yamamoto could not comprehend, a weapon that completely inverted the tactical reality of the battle. That weapon was combat intelligence. Down in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, in a windowless room known as Station HYPO, a team of eccentric codebreakers was performing miracles. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man who often worked 20-hour shifts wearing a smoking jacket and slippers to ward off the chill of the basement air conditioning, this team was intercepting and decrypting the Japanese naval code known as JN25B. It was a brutal mathematical grind, sifting through thousands of intercepted alphanumeric groups to find patterns. By May 1942, Rochefort's team knew the Japanese were planning a massive offensive against a target designated as AF. The codebreakers strongly suspected AF was Midway, but they needed proof to convince the top brass in Washington. So, how do you verify the target of an entire enemy fleet without tipping your hand? You lay a trap of your own. Rochefort instructed the garrison at Midway to broadcast a fake message in the clear, uncoded radio traffic, stating that their water distillation plant had broken down and they were running short of fresh water. A few days later, Station HYPO intercepted a coded Japanese message reporting to Tokyo that target AF was short of water. The trap had snapped shut. Nimitz now held the ultimate cheat code for naval warfare. He knew the target, he knew the approximate date of the attack, and he knew the general composition of the enemy fleet. This intelligence coup is easily comparable to George Washington's Culper spy ring, operating in New York during the American Revolution, where accurate information allowed a numerically inferior American force to outmaneuver a massive imperial military. Armed with this intelligence, Nimitz ordered his available carrier forces to immediately converge on a point roughly 325 miles northeast of Midway, a patch of ocean designated as Point Luck. The American task forces were commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. The United States brought 3 carriers to the fight. The USS Enterprise, CV-6, and the USS Hornet, CV-8, formed Task Force 16. The third carrier was the USS Yorktown, CV-5, forming Task Force 17. The presence of the Yorktown at Midway is one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history. Just weeks earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, Yorktown had been heavily damaged by Japanese bombs. When she limped back into Pearl Harbor on May 27, trailing an oil slick miles long, naval engineers estimated it would take 3 months in a mainland shipyard to repair her. Nimitz gave them 3 days. The moment Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1, over 1,400 shipfitters, welders, and electricians swarmed the 19,000-ton vessel. The temperature inside the lower decks reached a suffocating 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men passed out from heat exhaustion, were dragged to the deck, revived, and sent back down into the smoke-filled compartments. They patched the hull with massive steel plates, shored up the bulkheads with line timber, and repaired the flight deck. On May 30, Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor, heading for Point Luck, with civilian shipyard workers still aboard, actively welding bulkheads as the ship steamed into combat. The American air groups were a mix of rugged capability and dangerous obsolescence. The primary fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Unlike the Japanese Zero, the Wildcat was built like a flying anvil. It weighed over 5,800 pounds empty. It featured heavy armor plate behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb heavy machine gun fire without erupting into flames. While it could not outturn a Zero, American pilots developed tactics like the Thack Weave, using teamwork and heavy firepower to defeat the more nimble Japanese fighters. The American dive bomber was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. Powered by a massive Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engine, the Dauntless was slow, but it was incredibly rugged and highly accurate. Its signature perforated dive flaps allowed the aircraft to plummet toward the ocean at a controlled 70-degree angle, giving the pilot a stable platform to deliver a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb. However, the American torpedo bomber, the Douglas TBD Devastator, was a death trap. It was hopelessly slow, poorly armed, and practically obsolete the day the war started. Worse yet, it carried the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, a weapon so poorly designed that it was more likely to run deep, run off course, or simply bounce off an enemy hull than actually detonate. American torpedo bomber pilots knew they were flying inferior machines with defective weapons, yet they flew into the teeth of the enemy anyway. In total, the American force consisted of 3 carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 15 destroyers, carrying roughly 233 carrier-based aircraft. They were augmented by an additional 127 land-based aircraft stationed directly on Midway Atoll, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-26 Marauders, and Marine Corps fighter squadrons. The stage was now perfectly set. It is the first week of June 1942. The massive Japanese armada is slicing through the Pacific swells, maintaining strict radio silence, completely unaware that they are sailing directly into a meticulously calculated ambush. Admiral Nagumo stands on the bridge of the Akagi, confident that the American fleet is still anchored thousands of miles away in Hawaii. The dawn of June 4 is about to break across the Central Pacific, and with it, the absolute pinnacle of naval violence is about to be unleashed. At exactly 0430 hours on June 4th, the silence of the pre-dawn Pacific was shattered by the roaring radial engines of 108 Japanese aircraft launching from the decks of the Kido Butai. Led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, this massive strike force of Zeros, Vals, and Kates was tasked with pulverizing the American installations on Midway Atoll. The launch sequence of a 1940s aircraft carrier was a masterclass in choreographed chaos, requiring hundreds of men on a pitching wooden deck to spot, fuel, arm, and launch heavily laden aircraft into the wind with zero margin for error. The Japanese executed this flawlessly, a testament to their relentless peacetime training regimen. But as Tomonaga's strike package formed up and droned toward the southeast, the fundamental technological divide between the two navies was about to expose a fatal Japanese weakness. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not possess shipborne radar. They relied entirely on human eyeballs, utilizing incredibly powerful optical rangefinders and highly trained lookouts strapped to the highest masts of their warships. It is 1942, and one side is attempting to control the battlespace with glass lenses and binoculars, while the United States Navy is utilizing the CXAM radar system, capable of painting incoming aircraft formations from over 70 miles away. Because of this electronic overwatch, the defenders on Midway knew the Japanese were coming long before the first enemy engine was heard. The island's air raid sirens wailed, and every operational American aircraft was scrambled into the sky. The Marine Corps fighter squadrons defending Midway were equipped primarily with the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. Calling the Buffalo obsolete is an understatement. It was overweight, underpowered, and stripped of its maneuverability by the addition of necessary combat equipment like armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. Sending a Brewster Buffalo into a dogfight against a Mitsubishi Zero was the tactical equivalent of driving a golf cart into a demolition derby. The American pilots knew their aircraft were death traps, yet they climbed to 15,000 feet and dove into the Japanese formations anyway. The resulting air battle was a massacre. The agile Zeros danced around the sluggish American fighters, shredding them with 20mm cannon fire. Within minutes, the Marine fighter defense was effectively wiped out, but they had forced the Japanese strike package to expend precious fuel and ammunition before they even reached the island. How do you defend an island outpost when your primary fighter aircraft are functionally obsolete before they even leave the runway? You do not defend it, you simply endure the punishment. Tomonaga's bombers hammered the power plant, the seaplane hangars, and the fuel dumps on Midway, sending masses of thick black smoke into the morning sky. However, the American anti-aircraft fire was intense, and the runways themselves remained largely intact. As Tomonaga surveyed the burning atoll, he realized the primary objective had not been achieved. The island could still launch bombers. At 0700 hours, he keyed his radio and transmitted a fateful message back to the Kido Butai, stating that there was a need for a second attack wave. While Tomonaga was bombing the island, the American aircraft that had launched from Midway earlier that morning found the Japanese fleet. This was a ragtag collection of Army B-26 Marauders jury-rigged to carry torpedoes, Marine Corps Vindicator dive bombers, and the combat debut of the new Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Their attacks were completely uncoordinated, lacking any cohesive tactical doctrine. They came in piecemeal at different altitudes and different speeds. For the Japanese fleet, this was a moment of supreme confidence. The massive 36,000-ton carriers, maneuvering at 30 knots, gracefully dodged the American torpedoes. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the swarming Zeros, fell upon the unescorted American bombers and slaughtered them. Out of the 6 newly minted Avengers that attacked, 5 were shot down. The B-26 Marauders fared no better, with one heavily damaged bomber buzzing the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, narrowly missing the ship's bridge and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo himself. The American strikes from Midway scored exactly 0 hits on the Japanese fleet. To a casual observer, this looked like a total operational failure by the American forces, but in the unforgiving mechanics of carrier warfare, these doomed attacks were achieving something critical. They were forcing the Japanese carriers into radical, evasive maneuvers, which prevented them from launching their own aircraft. More importantly, these continuous, nagging attacks kept the Japanese Zeros down near the surface of the ocean, expending their ammunition and burning their fuel to swat away the American bombers. This uncoordinated American assault is eerily reminiscent of the chaotic Union attacks at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, where isolated, disjointed defensive stands by raw troops managed to disrupt the Confederate timetable just enough to prevent a total collapse. The Americans at Midway were bleeding, but they were buying the one commodity that actually mattered, which was time. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was now facing a catastrophic tactical dilemma. He had received Tomonaga's message requesting a second strike on Midway. Down on the enclosed hangar decks of his 4 carriers, Nagumo's reserve strike force was sitting fueled and armed with Type 91 armor-piercing torpedoes, waiting for the order to attack the American fleet if it ever showed up. But Nagumo's scout planes, launched hours earlier to search the ocean, had reported nothing. Believing the ocean was empty of American ships, Nagumo made a logical yet ultimately fatal decision. At 07:01 hours, he ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with 800-pound high-explosive land bombs for a second strike on the island. This is where we must dissect the brutal logistical reality of a 1940s hangar deck. You do not simply swap a 10,700-pound torpedo for an 800-pound bomb like you are changing a tire in a pit stop. It is a grueling, highly dangerous mechanical process. Dozens of armorers must use hand-cranked winches and specialized ordnance carts to lower the torpedoes from the aircraft bellies. The torpedoes must be carefully secured, their delicate gyroscopes protected. Then, the heavy land bombs must be hoisted up from the magazines deep within the ship, wheeled across the steel decks, and bolted onto the aircraft racks. This process takes at least an hour under ideal conditions. On the enclosed, unventilated hangar decks of the Japanese carriers, filled with the fumes of high-octane aviation fuel, hundreds of men were sweating and straining to execute Nagumo's order. The clock was ticking, and the hangar decks were rapidly becoming a chaotic powder keg of unsecured ordnance. Then the friction of war intervened. One of the Japanese scout planes, launched from the cruiser Tone, had been delayed by 30 minutes due to a catapult malfunction. At 07:28 hours, this scout plane, designated Tone Number 4, broke radio silence. The pilot reported sighting 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo's blood must have run cold. He immediately halted the rearming process. He demanded to know the composition of the enemy force. Were there aircraft carriers? The scout plane pilot, flying through heavy clouds and dodging American anti-aircraft fire, was agonizingly slow to respond. Finally, at 08:09 hours, the scout reported that one of the ships appeared to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo was now caught in a nightmare. His strike aircraft on the hangar deck were caught halfway through a munitions swap, with bombs and torpedoes lying unsecured on the deck. Furthermore, Tomonaga's returning strike force from Midway was now circling overhead, dangerously low on fuel, desperately needing to land. Nagumo's rigid adherence to doctrine paralyzed him. This hesitation is a direct parallel to Union General George McClellan at the Battle of Antietam. McClellan possessed General Robert E. Lee's actual battle plans, known as Special Order 191, yet he hesitated, second-guessed his intelligence, and refused to commit his reserves, allowing a decisive victory to slip through his fingers. Nagumo, faced with a sudden change in the tactical environment, chose to clear his flight decks to recover Tomonaga's aircraft rather than launching a hasty, disorganized strike against the American carrier. He ordered the ordnance crews to reverse their work, to take the land bombs off and put the torpedoes back on. The hangar decks of the Kido Butai devolved into absolute pandemonium. While Nagumo was shuffling ordnance in a panic, the American commanders were already acting. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, had calculated the distance to the Japanese fleet. He knew the maximum combat radius of his aircraft. Instead of waiting for the perfect moment, Spruance took a massive calculated risk. He ordered his carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet, to launch their strike packages early, at the extreme edge of their fuel range. Spruance wanted to catch the Japanese carriers exactly when they were most vulnerable, with their flight decks full of rearming aircraft. The American launch was a messy, disjointed affair. The squadrons from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown did not form up into a single, cohesive armada. Instead, they proceeded toward the target in isolated groups, navigating by dead reckoning over a featureless ocean. The first American carrier aircraft to find the Kido Butai was Torpedo Squadron 8, known as VT-8, launching from the USS Hornet, commanded by the fiercely independent Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. VT-8 consisted of 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Waldron had actually disagreed with the Hornet's group commander regarding the projected location of the Japanese fleet. Trusting his own instincts, Waldron broke formation, altered his course, and led his squadron directly to the enemy. At 09:20 hours, Waldron spotted the Japanese carriers. We must understand the suicidal geometry of a torpedo bombing run in 1942. To drop the notoriously unreliable Mark 13 torpedo, a pilot had to fly straight and level, at an altitude of exactly 50 feet above the waves, at a speed no greater than 110 knots. You cannot jink, you cannot dive, and you cannot evade. You are a slow-moving, unarmored target flying directly into a wall of steel. As Waldron's 15 Devastators began their attack run, the Japanese carriers turned away, forcing the Americans into a long, agonizing stern chase. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of over 50 Zeros, pounced on VT-8 like a pack of starving wolves. The American torpedo bombers had no fighter escort. The slaughter was absolute and systematic. The Zeros slashed through the formation, their 20mm cannons tearing the Devastators to pieces. Aircraft after aircraft erupted into flames and cartwheeled into the sea. Waldron's own plane was seen bursting into a fireball, yet he stood up in his burning cockpit before the aircraft plunged beneath the waves. Why would highly trained aviators fly obsolete aircraft at stall speeds directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire and swarming enemy fighters? Because in the brutal calculus of naval warfare, you press the attack until you have nothing left to give, trusting that your sacrifice will buy an opening for the man behind you. Out of the 15 aircraft in VT-8, all 15 were shot down. 30 men went into the water. Only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, hiding under a floating seat cushion as he watched the battle unfold around him. The horror did not end with VT-8. Shortly after Waldron's squadron was annihilated, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise arrived, followed by Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. They attacked with the same desperate courage, and they met the exact same fate. The Zeros, operating with ruthless efficiency, massacred the slow-moving American bombers. Out of the 41 Devastators launched by the American carriers that morning, only 6 survived the engagement. Not a single American torpedo found its mark on a Japanese hull. Admiral Nagumo and his staff on the Akagi watched the destruction of the American torpedo squadrons with a sense of invincibility, believing they had weathered the storm and were now ready to launch their own devastating counterattack. But the tactical reality of the battle space had just undergone a massive invisible shift. The Japanese Zeros had been fighting continuously for over an hour. They had been pulled down to sea level to intercept the torpedo bombers. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and entirely out of position. The Japanese fleet commanders were so focused on the threat skimming across the surface of the water that they forgot to look up. The sky directly above the Kido Butai, from 10,000 to 20,000 feet, was completely devoid of Japanese fighter cover. At that exact moment, high above the scattered clouds, 2 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, finally spotted the white wakes of the Japanese carriers painting the blue canvas of the Pacific Ocean. At exactly 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed the nose of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber over into a steep, screaming 70-degree dive. Behind him, 31 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise followed him down, plummeting from 15,000 feet toward the massive yellow-painted flight deck of the Japanese carrier Kaga. Simultaneously, a few miles away, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led 17 Dauntlesses from the USS Yorktown into a near-vertical dive targeting the carrier Soryu. The mechanics of a 1940s dive bombing run are an exercise in calculated terror, requiring the pilot to stare through a telescopic sight while gravity accelerates a 5-ton machine toward the ocean at over 250 miles per hour. You must ignore the black puffs of anti-aircraft flak bursting around your canopy. Hold the aircraft perfectly steady to ensure the bomb's trajectory, and wait until you are roughly 1,500 feet above the target before pulling the release handle. If you pull out too early, the bomb misses. If you pull out too late, you impact the deck alongside your ordnance. The Japanese lookouts on the carriers below finally spotted the diving Americans, screaming warnings into their sound-powered telephones, but it was far too late. The Zero fighters, which had just spent the last hour ruthlessly massacring the American torpedo bombers at sea level, were trapped thousands of feet below the incoming threat, frantically trying to claw their way back up to altitude. How does a highly disciplined, technologically advanced naval empire lose its grip on reality in exactly 5 minutes? It happens when arrogant tactical doctrine collides with the unforgiving physics of high explosives. The Kaga was the first to die. 4 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs smashed through her wooden flight deck in rapid succession. These bombs were equipped with delayed action fuses, designed to penetrate the upper decks before detonating deep within the bowels of the ship. When those 4 bombs exploded inside Kaga's fully enclosed hangar deck, they ignited a catastrophic chain reaction. Remember the frantic ordnance swap Admiral Nagumo had ordered earlier that morning? The hangar deck was littered with unsecured 800-pound high-explosive land bombs, highly volatile Type 91 aerial torpedoes, and dozens of fully fueled aircraft. The initial American bomb blasts ruptured the ship's aviation fuel lines, vaporizing the high-octane gas and turning the entire enclosed space into a massive fuel-air bomb. Sympathetic detonations ripped through the Kaga, blowing out the sides of the ship and sending a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air. Just a few miles away, the flagship Akagi suffered a similarly gruesome fate, courtesy of a brilliant piece of split-second tactical decision-making by Lieutenant Richard Best. During the chaotic dive, nearly all of the Enterprise bombers had mistakenly targeted the Kaga, leaving the Akagi completely untouched. Realizing the error in the middle of a 250-mile-per-hour plummet, Best forcefully pulled his aircraft out of the dive, leveled off, and banked hard to reposition himself over the Akagi, followed by just 2 wingmen. Best dropped his 1,000-pound bomb at the absolute last second. It was a perfect, devastating strike. The bomb penetrated the midships elevator and plunged into the hangar deck, detonating right in the middle of a cluster of fueled and armed Nakajima-Kate torpedo bombers. One single bomb was all it took to eviscerate the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The resulting explosion on the Akagi was so violent that it jammed the ship's rudder, forcing the burning Leviathan to steam in a slow, agonizing circle while Admiral Nagumo and his staff were forced to evacuate the bridge by climbing down ropes through a curtain of black smoke. Simultaneously, Max Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown planted 3 1,000-pound bombs into the deck of the Soryu, triggering the exact same apocalyptic chain reaction of secondary explosions. Between 10:22 a.m. and 10:27 a.m., a span of just 5 minutes, 3 of the most powerful warships on the planet were reduced to burning, uncontrollable slaughterhouses. The decisive battle doctrine, the concept of Kantai Kessen, that had driven Japanese naval architecture and strategy for 2 decades, was incinerated in that brief window of time. But the battle was not over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by the aggressive and highly capable Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, had been sailing further north and escaped the devastating morning dive bomber strike. Yamaguchi, realizing the catastrophic scale of the disaster, immediately launched a desperate counterattack against the American fleet. This is where we must examine the stark fundamental difference in damage control philosophy between the United States Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. When Yamaguchi's strike force of Aichi-Val dive bombers found the USS Yorktown later that afternoon, they managed to score 3 direct hits, stopping the American carrier dead in the water and starting massive fires. A Japanese carrier hit this severely would have been abandoned. But the United States Navy trained every single sailor, from the cooks to the yeomen, in advanced damage control techniques. The Yorktown was equipped with a redundant, centralized fire main system that allowed crews to isolate damaged sections of piping and route high-pressure water to the fires. American engineering officers quickly flooded counter compartments to correct the ship's list, patched the boilers, and within 2 hours, the Yorktown was incredibly underway again, making 19 knots and launching fighters. When a second wave of Japanese Nakajima-Kate torpedo bombers arrived shortly after, they saw a functioning carrier and assumed they had found a brand new target, completely unaware it was the same ship their dive bombers had just crippled. They slammed 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown's port side, finally inflicting fatal damage and forcing Captain Elliot Buckmaster to order the crew to abandon ship. By absorbing 2 separate, massive Japanese airstrikes, the heavily damaged Yorktown effectively shielded the Enterprise and the Hornet from destruction, acting as a massive steel sponge for enemy ordnance. With the Yorktown abandoned, Admiral Raymond Spruance unleashed his remaining dive bombers from the Enterprise and Hornet to hunt down the Hiryu. Late in the afternoon, the American squadrons found Yamaguchi's flagship and buried it under a deluge of 1,000-pound bombs, blowing the entire forward elevator assembly completely off the ship and into the ocean. Admiral Yamaguchi, adhering to the fatalistic samurai code that permeated the Japanese military establishment, chose to tie himself to the bridge and go down with his burning ship. By nightfall on June 4th, the Kido Butai, the invincible spearhead of the Japanese Empire, simply ceased to exist. To fully decode the Battle of Midway, we must pull back from the tactical bloodshed and analyze the massive strategic, logistical, and economic shockwaves that this battle generated. Tactically, the Japanese lost 4 heavy fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and 248 aircraft. But the most irreplaceable loss was the human capital. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors were killed, including their most experienced mechanics, armorers, and elite aviators. The Japanese pilot training program was fundamentally flawed from its inception. It was a boutique, highly selective, almost artisanal process designed to produce a few hundred magnificent pilots a year. They believed in quality to the absolute exclusion of quantity. When those veteran pilots died at Midway, there was no pipeline of trained replacements ready to take their seats. Conversely, the United States had established the civilian pilot training program before the war even started, creating a massive industrialized pipeline that churned out tens of thousands of competent, aggressive aviators. We can directly compare this logistical disparity to the American Civil War, specifically Ulysses S. Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was as highly skilled, veteran force that won stunning tactical victories, much like the Japanese Navy in early 1942. But the agrarian South possessed zero industrial depth. When Lee lost his veteran officers and soldiers, they were gone forever. Grant, backed by the massive industrial and demographic machinery of the North, could absorb horrific casualties at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, replace those losses within weeks, and continue grinding the enemy into dust. Imperial Japan was the Confederacy of the Pacific. They were an island nation with a fraction of America's steel production, oil reserves, and manufacturing base, attempting to fight a war of attrition against an industrial titan. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single day was an economic death sentence for Tokyo. Prior to the war, the United States Congress had passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, a staggering piece of legislation that authorized the construction of 24 massive Essex-class aircraft carriers, dozens of cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers. While the Japanese were desperately trying to convert civilian ocean liners into slow, inadequate escort carriers to replace their losses, the shipyards in Brooklyn, Newport News, and Philadelphia were operating 24 hours a day, preparing to flood the Pacific with an armada of steel so massive it defied human comprehension. Midway did not win the war for the United States, but it permanently shattered Japan's ability to wage offensive naval operations. From an intelligence perspective, the American victory at Midway is one of the greatest force multipliers in the history of human conflict. Commander Joseph Rochefort and the eccentric codebreakers at Station HYPO proved that information dominance is just as lethal as a 1,000-pound bomb. Is this not exactly what happened in World War I when British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram? By intercepting and decoding a secret diplomatic communication, the British managed to draw the United States into the war, fundamentally altering the global balance of power without firing a single bullet. At Midway, Nimitz used decrypted radio traffic to place his numerically inferior force in the exact right place at the exact right time, completely ambushing an enemy that believed they held total operational surprise. The Japanese defeat was also a spectacular failure of military doctrine. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was overly complex, requiring multiple task forces to operate in strict coordination over thousands of miles of ocean while maintaining absolute radio silence. When the friction of war occurred, when the American carriers showed up unexpectedly, the rigid Japanese command structure collapsed. Admiral Nagumo was paralyzed by his adherence to the textbook, unable to adapt to a fluid, chaotic battle space. We see this exact same fatal rigidity in the British Army during the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. The highly disciplined British regulars marched in perfect, textbook linear formations directly into the concentrated artillery and rifle fire of Andrew Jackson's entrenched American forces. They refused to adapt their tactics to the muddy, swampy terrain and were systematically slaughtered by an enemy that embraced flexibility and raw firepower. The Imperial Japanese Navy at Midway marched their beautiful, unarmored aircraft carriers right into a trap because their doctrine blinded them to the reality of the situation. The Battle of Midway stands as the ultimate testament to the brutal mathematical reality of modern warfare. It proves that courage without intelligence is a death sentence, that industrial logistics will always crush tactical brilliance in a protracted conflict, and that a single, heavily armed dive bomber in the right place can change the destiny of the world. The Japanese Empire awoke on June 4th, expecting to finalize their conquest of the Pacific. They went to sleep that night as a doomed nation, bleeding out in the dark waters, waiting for the inevitable American steel tsunami to wash over their homeland. In the unforgiving arena of war, victory does not belong to the invincible, but to those who can violently adapt when their plans turn to ashes. Now it is your turn to weigh in on this historic clash. What do you believe was the single biggest factor that doomed the Japanese fleet at Midway? A. The fatal lack of shipborne radar and poor damage control. B. The American codebreakers at Station HYPO uncovering the trap. C. Admiral Nagumo's disastrous hesitation in rearming his aircraft. Drop your answer in the comments below, let me know your reasoning, and make sure you are subscribed for our next deep dive into the machinery of war.